Hey everybody, welcome to Bible class. Can you join me at the very end of Acts 21? We are nearing the end of our study of the book of Acts. It has been quite a journey as we have watched these earliest disciples be witnesses of the faith. It started in the city of Jerusalem. There were people who had gathered in Jerusalem from all over the place on the day of Pentecost. It started out spectacularly with 3,000 people responding to the news of Jesus. Most recently, we've been with Paul, launching from the city of Antioch, carrying the gospel of Jesus further and further and further away. We are going to journey with him very soon all the way to Rome. But we left him in our last study in the city of Jerusalem. There were lies told about him, and he was arrested. In fact, we can pick it up in Acts 21, verse 30, where Luke tells us Jerusalem was stirred up. The people ran together. They seized Paul. They dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill Paul, word came to the Roman tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. What I want you to see is this gives Paul an opportunity to tell his story and point people to Jesus. As he's led by these Roman soldiers, the mob of the people is following, crying out, "Away with him!" And as Paul is about to be brought into the barracks, he says to the Roman tribune, "May I say something to you?" "Do you know Greek?" the Roman asks. "Aren't you the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul says, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. There was a great hush. He addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, verse 1 of chapter 22, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." In fact, over the next few chapters, we're going to hear Paul make a defense before a variety of people. We've learned his story beginning all the way back there at the end of Acts 7 and into Acts chapter 8 and 9, right? When they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he begins telling them his story. Down in verse 21, he gets all the way down to the point where he says, "God told me, go. I'm sending you far away to the Gentiles." And that was enough for many of these Jews in Jerusalem. They said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." They didn't believe in that mission statement of Jesus we've reminded ourselves of over and over and over again. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. In Acts chapter 23, Paul is led before the Jewish council. He's got an opportunity to tell them the story. "Brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." He's arrested. He can't move around freely. It's looking bad for Paul in Jerusalem. You might dig more into that as a class. For now, notice in Acts 23, verse 11, that following night, the Lord stood by Paul in custody and said, "Take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." God is going to be with Paul all the way to the great city of Rome. When it was day, Luke tells us, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There was more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We've strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you along with the council give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now, it's interesting. Luke tells us that the son of Paul's sister, we don't even know her name, but her son heard about this planned ambush. He went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul uses his Roman citizenship. In fact, he's carried by Romans from Jerusalem over here to the great city of Caesarea, where he appears before authority after authority. Before Felix in Acts 24. Felix, Luke tells us in verse 22, had a rather accurate knowledge of the way. He wants to hear what Paul has to say. It's Felix who, in Acts 24, verse 24, comes with his wife. He sings for Paul. He hears Paul talk about faith in Christ Jesus. And Paul, what does he do? The same thing he's been doing all along. He reasons about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. Felix hears that and he's alarmed and he says, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." Eventually, Felix is succeeded by a man named Festus. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix leaves Paul in prison. Well, Paul is just going to continue sharing this news. In Acts chapter 26, he's got the opportunity to stand before King Agrippa. And what does he do? He tells his story, and he points Agrippa to Jesus. Read it with me in Acts 26, verse 22. Paul says, "To this day, I've had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. That the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles." As he's saying these things in his defense, Festus says with a loud voice, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad." Paul says, "I'm not out of my mind. I'm speaking true and rational words. The king knows about these things. To him I speak boldly. I'm persuaded that none of these things have escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." It's Agrippa who says to Paul, "In a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul said, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." Ultimately, Paul has appealed as a Roman citizen to Caesar. And so, Lord willing, next time we'll follow him all the way to the city of Rome. And we know what he's going to do there. He's going to tell his story and talk about Jesus. In the meantime, Luke has given us plenty to talk about. So let's do that together. Hope you have a great rest of your class and a great start to this new week.